what many people don't know. So a good number of the Russian evangelical churches right now are pastored by Ukrainians.
What?
I've met some of them, and their hearts are ripped apart. Because in the 90s and in the 2000s, there was a great mission movement that spilled out of Ukraine into the former Soviet Union. And many Ukrainians went because of their love for Russians. So now you have these pastors leading Russian churches who are Ukrainian and have a deep love for the Russian people, but they're Ukrainian.
No, they're not being loved.
And they don't know, and there's a tension of how do they speak about the war? How do you make a political statement when there's going to be great cost attached to that? Especially the Middle East one a little bit. So the Peace and Reconciliation Network is a commission of the World Evangelical Alliance. So are you all familiar with the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada, the EFC? We'll use a bunch of acronyms. But the EFC is one of 143 national alliances globally of evangelical Christians. So the EFC is one of a large global family. Together, that global family is called the World Evangelical Alliance. And it functions not really, it's not an organization, it's not the Vatican, like in that type of structure. It's a global fellowship, it's a global alliance. And so that global alliance has different ways in which it cooperates and seeks to strengthen all these national bodies around the world. And the national bodies are in various stages of formation. So Canada is a very mature alliance. It's probably one of the healthiest in the world. You know, pretty large staff, engaged in all kinds of things from on Parliament Hill all the way down to like working with smaller ministries and organizations and helping Canada, the evangelicals in Canada, unite together on different things. Other places like Vietnam has a 3-year-old alliance. So even though Vietnam is still a communist government, there's an evangelical alliance in Vietnam that's about 3 years old. And then you can look at other places in the world. I just got back from being with the Central Asia team, our PRN Central Asia team. There's evangelical alliances in Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, which is one of the most closed countries on earth. Very challenging place to be a Christian. And so, but there's an evangelical alliance there. So we have representatives from all of those countries on our Central Asia team. So WEA works as a global family, has these different initiatives or commissions and ministries that help strengthen these alliances. And in 2016, the Peace and Reconciliation Network was formed. Dr. Johannes Reimer was the founder of it. Johannes spoke at KGF, actually. First Sunday of the pandemic.
Oh, wow.
Yes, way back on that memorable week. And so Johannes had been asked to start it. There was a number of people that were part of an advisory team that worked with him, and the network was born, and with the vision of bringing peacemaking and reconciliation ministry to the heart of the mission of the church. And that was initiated actually at the request of the United Nations in Asia. So my role is to support these leaders in their different regions, help them stay on task with what we're about, which I'll explain a bit more, and help them contextualize it and live it out in the regions where they are, and then for me to help open up new regions that we're not in yet, like Latin America, which hopefully will happen this year. We've had conversations. The US is an ongoing conversation, the Caribbean, Australia. So we've got different regions we need to keep opening up so that we become a true global network. Because as a network, we're really not an organization. So Stephanie's right in what she was saying earlier. We need this infrastructure kind of base funding to do our network activity. But we're never going to be a huge organization because that's not our role. Our role is to come alongside and help strengthen. And so we inspire, we equip, and we connect. That's what PRN's role is. So we inspire, we draw out the stories of where God is at work, where the church is active as a peacemaking and reconciling force, and try to tell those stories. Because even though what we see in the news, we always see the bad stuff in the news, right? Often down beneath the surface, the church is doing amazing things, but nobody ever hears about it. So we try to lift that up. And when we can do that, it helps inspire and awaken that, maybe we can all be involved in some way, in some place, somewhere, somehow, because all of us, if we took 2 minutes, could all identify a place of conflict we're living, right? And are involved in, from whether it's our household or our neighborhood or, the politics talked out in the bush or whatever it is. And so we inspire, and then the equipping part is we do some developing of our own material and training and equipping, because it's to strengthen a strong evangelical peacemaking and ministry of reconciliation theology and practice, because it's often one of the missing pieces, is people don't have the paradigm for it. They've left peacemaking and reconciliation it's either gone over into just the political sphere, and we expect governments to work at that, or in the Christian world it gets pushed into the activist sphere, where there's a few weird people who go around doing that stuff, and they're kind of off the side. And we say, no, actually biblical reconciliation, if you look at reconciliation in Scripture, encompasses four dimensions. Between us and God, that's crucial, it's what Christ won on the cross. Us with ourselves, all the stuff that we have to work on personally and reconcile with being human. With one another, including our enemies, so that becomes a social dimension. And with creation, because human beings are out of step with creation. And so that is actually the biblical picture of shalom, the Old Testament Hebrew word, wholeness, flourishing, life as God intended. And so we try to elevate that equipping, some of which we produce ourselves, but the vast majority of which, like Healing Hearts Transforming Nations, is we get to know these places and ministries, often which are birthed out of some of the most horrendous suffering, and try to elevate that and connect it globally. And that's what's happening with Healing Hearts Transforming Nations, which was a ministry birthed out of the Rwandan genocide in the 90s. You all know about that. Terrible stuff. But this healing ministry was birthed out of it that began to reconcile people, Hutus and Tutsis, together. It flowed over into other parts of Africa, and as Stephanie said, like literally this week, they were leading training in Ontario that was bringing together Slavic leaders and Indigenous leaders, many Indigenous leaders, and non-Indigenous leaders. So there you have a story of something that was birthed out of the trauma of Rwanda that is now impacting what needs to be healed in our country. And so it's really kind of cool, and our job is to help connect these things. So that's the inspire, equip, and connect. And that's also why it's really hard to raise money, to be honest, because it's not tangible in some ways. It's a little nebulous, and it's hard for people to get their head around because you're looking for the immediate outcome. How is my donation helping accomplish this? Well, most of the work we do is investing in stuff that you might not see the fruit for 10 years. So the work we're doing with Ukraine and Russia right now is to establish threads of relationship between Russian leaders and Ukrainian leaders that will serve for the ongoing healing of those nations when the war is over. And hopefully already, but it's challenging right now. So that's where we just had a meeting this morning, that's why it's fresh in my mind, but our journey with that in Canada, we produced a pastoral letter to the church in Canada. If you take out your phone and Google Canadian Pastoral Letter EFC, you'll discover it. and it was the Canadian Council of Churches, the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada, independent Slavic church leaders. There's a Slavic church here, in more than one actually, but there's a Slavic Baptist church here on Richter Street. Common story across Canada. Many people don't realize there's a Russian-speaking church in their city, or more than one, and those churches have often been there longer than some of the English-speaking churches. And those churches have gone through incredible challenges the last couple of years because of the war. Because most of those churches were started in Canada before the Soviet Union fell, or around the time the Soviet Union fell, and they were all Russian-speaking, and they were all Christians coming out of a common story of their suffering. But they were coming from Belarus and Ukraine and Russia and Kazakhstan, and they could all get along until Russia invaded Ukraine. And in the global story of how the Russian Evangelical Alliance, and in the great mystery of things, there is a Russian Evangelical Alliance, but there is not a Ukrainian Evangelical Alliance. So there's the equivalent of the EFC in Russia, but there's not the equivalent of the EFC in Ukraine yet. And most of the Russian evangelical churches were planted by Ukrainians. This is what many people don't know. So a good number of the Russian evangelical churches right now are pastored by Ukrainians.
What?
I've met some of them, and their hearts are ripped apart.
Yeah.
Because in the 90s and in the 2000s, there was a great mission movement that spilled out of Ukraine into the former Soviet Union. And many Ukrainians went because of their love for Russians. So now you have these pastors leading Russian churches who are Ukrainian and have a deep love for the Russian people, but they're Ukrainian.
No, they're not being loved.
And they don't know, and there's a tension of how do they speak about the war? How do you make a political statement when there's going to be great cost attached to that? And you have Ukrainian church leaders saying, why aren't you speaking up? And it's creating tensions between churches, great tensions, and lots of pain. So we're working to keep these threads of relationships together. And in Canada, this pastoral letter we wrote was an attempt to demonstrate that in Canada. And the meeting this morning was hopefully in June there'll be a delegation that even goes and presents to parliamentarians, to members of parliament. Because what Canadian members of parliament, our government doesn't understand, is that there is something called the Ruski Mir. Have you heard that name? The Ruski Mir is the Russian, it means Russian world, the Russian way of seeing things. And the Ruski Mir is a theological position which is being taught, and there was statements even in the last couple of weeks by the Russian Orthodox Church that calls the current war a holy war, and that Russia is God's servant holding off the decadence and depravity of Western civilization, and will be the third Rome. Okay, there was Constantinople, there was Rome, and there will be Moscow. That's the
Belief.
That's the belief. And Putin has maximized that theological position
Right.
and built upon that and expanded it, and the Russian Orthodox Church stands in support of what's happening. So when we hear the ramping up of militarism about the war in Ukraine, the piece that most governments are paying zero attention to is there is actually a theological foundation to this that just sending more weapons isn't going to solve. You have to have a conversation between leaders who can speak a language with one another, and that's why there's a place for religious leaders in what's happening. Because without that engagement, the politicians are not going to have that conversation. So are we just going to keep blowing each other up? Is that the solution? Is it just going to be who has spent the most, has the most, and is the last civilization standing? Is that where we're headed? Between nuclear powers. So you can see, right? Like it's very complex, But PRN's role is to help walk this middle path and to foster these conversations. So what happened with the pastoral letter, what's happening with the delegation to Ottawa, what's happening with, when I was in Turkey, there were Russians and Ukrainians there, we're having conversations, just keeping threads of relationships together.
Well, can I speak to
None
this?
of that, sorry, yeah, just one of that, the pastoral letter, none of these things would have happened without PRN. But when it went out there, we don't get known. It's because we want the EFC and the Canadian Council of Churches to be heard and to be known. That's our job, is to be in that background. But like the meeting today doesn't happen without us calling all those leaders together and saying, it's time to meet. And then they do, and they look to us to lead it and to just keep the conversation going.